A national newspaper informed that the movement of two army units in January 2012 towards Delhi sent alarm bells ringing in Raisin Hill. It seems like dramatic stuff. But besides dismissing the alarmist report, it is useful to briefly look at our military history to put the troop movement in context. The Indian Air Force was not informed of the move of para unit, so there was added reason for suspicion it's being claimed. While then Defence Minister A.K. Antony denied the report that movement of any army personnel towards the capital on intervening night of January 16 and 17 was a breach of protocol, the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh observed that this report was alarmist and should not be taken to face value. The man at the centre of the storm was Army Chief General V.K. Singh, has himself termed the report absurd. Yet none of them have denied the troop movement. Ajit Doval, former Intelligence Bureau Director, has said that the agency is mandated to counter coups and there are government instructions regarding troop movements near Delhi. The newspaper report also told us lookouts were activated, columns identified and tracked, and contingency plans to delay their progress to Delhi were put in place. In 1957, the then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, visiting the office of General Thimmaiya, the Chief of Army Staff, saw a steel cabinet behind his desk and asked the general what it contained. The general replied that the top drawer contained the nation's defense plans, and the second drawer contained the confidential files of the nation's top generals, and the third drawer inquired Nehru. "Ha," said the general with a straight face, "the third drawer contains my secret plans for military coup against you." Nehru laughed, but there was apparently a tinge of nervousness to his laughter. Military dictatorships have been common phenomena in post-colonial states of Asia and Africa. In the 1950s and 60s, a dictatorship in India was not an impossibility. In fact, while covering the 1967 general election, the Times correspondent Neville Maxwell prophesied that this might be the last election ever in the country. And he was not the only one who believed that sooner or later India would fall under military rule, but that eventually, of course, never happened. The question why the Indian Army never attempted to seize the power has sometimes been attributed to the fact that it is disciplined, highly professional and steeped in proud 250-year-old tradition inherited from British. But this theory doesn't work because Pakistani army was born out of the same traditions, and that didn't seem to stop them from assuming power. Indeed, one could argue that it was precisely because the Pakistan army was such highly professional force that there came in a time when it felt that it could no longer stand by and watch the country slide into chaos, and felt it was its duty to step in. So clearly, this is a question one needs to look at more closely, which is what political scientist Stephen Wilkinson has done with his book Army and the Nation. In order to understand what didn't happen in India, it's perhaps useful to first look out for what did happen in Pakistan. The military dictatorship in Pakistan has had an interesting prehistory. It begins in undivided India, where the largest single component of the army was drawn from the undivided Punjab. Hence, at the time of partition, all the institutions that Pakistan inherited, the most substantive was its army. Moreover, while in India, Congress Party was highly evolved, durable organization. In Pakistan, the Muslim League was not much more than Jinnah and his private secretary. Hence, there was a dangerous structural imbalance in Pakistan, especially after Jinnah's death in 1948. The military dictatorship in Pakistan did not come out of the blue. In early 1950s, for example, there were riots in Lahore that raged on because of the civilian authorities were unable to control them. Finally, the army was called out and it was swiftly and firmly put down the trouble. Then the commanding officer made an unusual request. He asked for another couple of days before withdrawing his troops to the barracks. In those few quick days, the army proceeded to clean up the city, paint the buildings, repair the roads, put down unauthorized structures and plant trees. Then, having performed all the long neglected civic tasks, the army quietly withdrew, leaving Lahore looking as clean and well ordered as an army cantonment. This earned the army a great deal of respect among public. It had managed to do for the city in few days what the civilian authority had failed to do over the years. Hence, when in 1958 the Governor General of Pakistan responded to a state of political chaos in the country by declaring martial law and calling out the army, there was a section of public that rejoiced at the news. In fact, a saying that went around at the time was, "Pakistan mein ab to mashallah ho gaya," playing with the term martial law. What followed over the next few years was a period of remarkable national development in Pakistan under the presidency of General Ayub Khan. Before the military government began to get corrupted, by its own power, as always inevitably happens in such a system. The Indian Army was born out of the same tradition as Pakistan's. In British India, the Army enjoyed a prominent position in Indian life, even played a role in policy matters. The Commander-in-Chief was also de facto Defence Minister and was the second most powerful person in Iraqi after the Viceroy himself. But after independence, things began to change. Prime Minister Nehru believed that New India needed to rethink the role of the Army and initiated a policy that would firmly subordinate it to the civilian authority. One of the first things that happened after independence, for example, was that Teen Murti Bhavan, traditionally the grand residence of the army chief, was assigned instead to the Prime Minister. A small matter by itself, perhaps, but a clear indicator of the way the wind was blowing. Next came the series of budget cuts, resulting among the other things hefty cuts in the army officers' generous British Raj era salaries. And when India's first army chief, Field Marshal Cariappa, publicly criticized the government's economic performance, he was immediately told not to meddle in the matters that did not concern him. Over the years, a systematic program was pursued to ring-fence the armed forces and their influence in Indian society, a program that was given a fresh urgency in 1958 by the military coup in next-door Pakistan, an occurrence that was worryingly praised by Field Marshal Cariappa, who had recently retired as army chief. A highlight, or rather low light, of the ring-fencing program was appointment of Krishna Menon, a powerful, abrasive leftist intellectual, as defense minister. It was an attempt to put the armed forces unambiguously in their place. The logic was to create diversity and not maintain homogeneity, which, as in case of Pakistan and Bangladesh, was among the root causes of military coups in two countries. In Pakistan, since its creation, Punjabis continued to dominate the army, the single most important and powerful armed forces institution, and often also the chief mischief makers. Armies with a sense of unity are more likely to intervene in politics than those not configured. A second important step, it survives in healthy form even to this day, was to make military subordinate to civilian authority, which was empowered to take decisions even during wartime. In the line with this measure, the office of Commander-in-Chief was abolished and power, howsoever minimal, was equally distributed among the chiefs of the Army, Air Force and the Navy. This in effect institutionalized the concept of not just separation of the powers but of checks and balance. Over the time, and primarily because of expediency arising out of India-China War of 1962, a number of paramilitary forces, BSF, SSB, were established to guard the borders, which till the point of time was sole preserve of the army. The central paramilitary forces also attracted employment among all ethnic categories in India, besides being a check on perceived supremacy of the army, institutionalizing internal division, creating a civilian-controlled army, making paramilitary forces responsible for handling internal security, and establishing a civilian agency for intelligence gathering has certainly characterized India's success story in preventing coups. By the 1970s, the Indian armed forces had finally been rendered coup-proof by compressive system of checks and balances that had been put in place, and that might be considered to be one of the major achievements of the Nehru era, ensuring the durability of Indian democracy. It is an achievement that is not sufficiently recognized, an achievement underscored by the fact that all of India's neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, Sri Lanka, have experienced military coups, actual or attempted. Wilkinson explains how coup-proofing was implemented through a package of carefully thought-out measures ranging from diversifying the ethnic composition of the armed forces to setting up ruck command and control structures, recasting the order of precedence between civil and military authorities, paying close attention to promotions, disallowing army officers from making public statements, creating a counterbalancing paramilitary force, and topping off this entire effort with little touches like ensuring that retired chiefs of the staff were usually sent off as ambassadors to faraway countries. The end result of all this is that when in 2012 newspapers breathlessly reported that there was a coup attempt with army units being moved towards Delhi in wake of General V.K. Singh's affair, people like you and I merely shrugged and said what nonsense and turned to the sports page. We perhaps don't realize what a luxury that kind of certainty is.